So I'm really trying to somewhat continue the last year and looking very deeply because, I mean, with the last year, I was able to unify, a lot of things that suddenly make sense. The concept of God creating the first day, the first light, and then hiding it because he saw mankind wasn't worthy of that light. And then the next thing was the Matan Torah, where Moshe Rabbeinu brought down the first tablets, which were the 50th gate, the highest gate in the Torah. But at the same time, he saw them, worshipping the golden calf, the Egel Azov, and he broke the tablets, kind of broke them, and then finally Moshe Rabbeinu seeing the future, and he saw Rabbi Akiva learning a certain way, and he realized that Rabbi Akiva was able to learn according to the methodology of the 50th gate, and him being very surprised at this. And then finally, Rabbi Akiva being successful in initiating the 50th gate, but suddenly telling his students to hide it, and so on. And then from there, for the last 2,000 years, we see the progression of the Kabbalah. And it's progressing in a way where it's mostly mashal. It's really metaphors and symbols. We don't really have the true knowledge of the meaning of the Kabbalah, which is called the Nimshal. And finally, having Moshe Chaim Luzzatto publicize the Nimshal to some extent, he began the study of the Nimshal. So when you look at all these different pieces, all of these pieces appear completely separate from each other. But in actuality, they tell you a single story, and a story which is so important that I don't know anyone who knows this story. But what I put together is a certain story, and I don't remember if I said that full story last time, but it's a very deep story, because the real question is, on the first day, God created a certain light, and he decided to hide the light because he saw mankind would sin. So the question is, so what? Just because man sins doesn't mean God hides the light of the Torah itself. So what actually is going on, in other words? And then finally, on Shavuos, which just passed, we are now looking at the what should be a 50th gate. And this is what Moshe Rabbeinu brought down from heaven when he brought down the Luchos. And when he brought down the Luchos, that was supposed to be on the level of the 50th gate. And it was supposed to be the initiation of the Messianic period. Most people don't realize that when Moshe Rabbeinu revealed the Torah, it was not the Torah that we really have, but it was the Torah in the form of the 50th gate, which allows it to reveal almost everything which is hidden. And suddenly we see the unity of human history, why every period in human history happened, and what it attains, what it tries to accomplish. But the real question is, what does it mean that the 50th gate, what exactly is that light? Because we see that throughout history, the whole purpose of God is not to reveal the light only under certain circumstances. And the question is why? Why does God reveal certain lights, a certain depth of chokhmah, and hide others? What is the meaning of that? So what I feel that the real meaning of that is what that life contains. And what it contains is the information that's really relevant to this world. And what is this information, and why must it be hidden? Well, the answer to that, I believe, is that God operates with two midos, with two attributes in terms of his connection to the world. He operates through the attribute of justice, and he operates through the attribute of mercy. And these are the two things. And there's a third operation, actually, which I will speak to at another time, where mercy has two levels. There's the mercy of someone who does a sin and recants on the sin and wants to do tshuva. That's one aspect of mercy. But there's a new aspect of mercy which is much deeper, which applies to people who sin, but in such a grievous way that literally it's said of them that they lose their chedek in olam haba. They lose their complete portion in the world to come. And this is sinning to the worst degree. Yet there's an aspect of compassion where God can even try and save those people. And that was at the behest of the Mashiach himself. That the Mashiach ben David was actually Adam Arishan. But the Mashiach ben Yosef is actually responsible for the activity of compassion where God has mercy. But then there's a third Mashiach, the Mashiach ben Dan. And his role is very different than the Mashiach ben Yosef, because the Mashiach ben Dan literally volunteered to try and save all those people who have no shaykhis to olam haba, who normally under normal conditions would lose olam haba. And even according to the attribute of mercy, they would lose the olam haba. So it says on them, Einem chedek olam haba. And the largest class of people who are applicable to this are Muslim, people who join the Goyim against the Jews who no longer feel at all any connection with other Jews, and they signal this lack of connection by joining the other Goyim to actually relate tales about Jews and get them in trouble with the Goyim. So when Jews relate to Goyim and they tell stories of Jews that get them in trouble, either by getting them killed or getting them robbed, these people are called Muslim. And what the Gemara says and what the Tefillah says in Shemona 3, let those who speak Lashon Hara to Goyim about Jews and thereby get them in trouble, they should have no portion whatsoever in the world to come. And this is a very severe, there's a very severe tefillah in the Shimon Esrei. Yet, there is an aspect of the Mashiach which says that they should be saved on some level. And he initiates a certain compassion, a certain midah, which is actually non-existent. But he initiates this midah and is able, in certain ways, to save these things. In actuality, what he is doing, he volunteers to accept the suffering that usually is the portion of the Mashiach, to suffer as he expiates the sins on a certain level of Klal Yisrael. But to allow people to exist who who really are not worthy of even any chelik in Olam Haba, requires an unusual amount of suffering. And this person who does this, who volunteered to do this, is called the Mashiach ben Don. He's from the Shebadan, and so on. And the example of that person was given by Shimon or Samson. And you can tell that he's a Mashiach ben Don from a simple story. Shimon or Samson was a judge in the Sanhedrin. He was the Gadol Hador. Even though he was a very powerful man physically, he was also very enlightened in terms of Torah, and he was the leader of the generation. But if you were a person who went to Shebadan and you said to that Shevat, I'd like to see the head of Shebadan, who's the Mashiach ben Don, they would tell you a very strange thing. Well, he's not living here with us. He does not live in the area of Israel, which is occupied by Shebadan, by the tribe of Dan. So where is he? Well, he now lives with the Philistines, and he's living together with a Philistine woman who some say converted and some say didn't convert. But her name was Delilah. So this is very odd. Whoever heard of a Gadol Hador? Whoever heard of the greatest in the world, not even living with Jews, but living with Goyim, and so on. So this whole thing is very odd. So what it indicates is the uniqueness of the Mashiach Adon, that he is completely hidden. You know, the Mashiach ben David and the Mashiach ben Yosef are somewhat hidden, but they're revealed. They're revealed in the knowledge of the Torah that they have, and that they're revealed to some extent in their task. But this new Mashiach, the Mashiach ben Dan, is completely hidden, because he doesn't even live with the Jews, and therefore he's not even associated with them in a certain way. So this is a very strange thing, that the Gadol Hador doesn't live with the Jewish people. But the Mashiach ben Dan had to undertake that form of suffering and that form of golus. That's a golus. It's an extreme form of exile. Not to live with Jews who live in the land of Israel, but to live with the Philistines, to live with the Goyim at that time. And that's an extreme form of golus. And the Mashiach ben Dan has to enter that golus in order to retrieve those people who really are cancelled from Olam Haba. Not only that, he has to retrieve the 50th gate, which is contained in the deepest part of the exile. So in a certain sense, the Mashiach ben Dan is synonymous with the golus. He lives in the golus. His mind is constantly preoccupied with the golus. In other words, he has very little to do with the Jewish people itself. And that's the level of his containment. That's the level of his suffering. So we understand something about this. But in any case, we see that the ultimate purpose of God is to judge the world with justice and mercy, so that eventually Klal Yisrael can earn a chelik, portion in the world to come. But why is it that suddenly God says, I don't want to reveal that light, the light of the first day? What does that mean? And so on. So what I believe it means is because the light of the first day indicates the continuity of all worlds from Olam Haba to Olam Hazeh. It indicates the information of how God created all the worlds, one after another, and how these worlds are related to the concept of justice, din, and the concept of mercy, rachamim. So if this light reveals this yichud, the way these attributes relate, why hide them? Because there's a very strange attribute of the midah of rachamim. Rachamim is a very strange midah. Why? Because fundamentally rachamim is the opposite of din. It's not simply God having compassion on people who need compassion. Because the truth is, compassion on people who sin is an impossibility. It's really an impossibility. Because the attribute of justice says a person gets what he deserves, ultimately. And therefore he gets also, conversely, what he doesn't deserve. So if he doesn't deserve a portion in the world to come, or something like that, because he sinned, he's unplugged from God. And if you are unplugged from God, you should cease to exist. So the attribute of justice fundamentally follows the quality that if you sin, you've lost your chance to earn what's called olam haba. So therefore we see that the attribute of justice is highly conditional. It depends on what you do, precisely what you do. It doesn't give you any more or any less of a chelek in olam haba than what you've earned. So if a person's a sinner and doesn't really deserve it, he's unplugged from God. So what does it mean that the attribute of mercy saves him? How could the attribute of mercy or compassion, which is called the midas harachman, even function? It even operates. Its very existence to operate is completely against the attribute of justice. So we're saying, therefore, that God, not only that God possesses two attributes, but he possesses two opposing attributes. Two attributes, judgment and mercy, which are in essence a contradiction. They are a contradiction to each other. So how can they coexist? How can two opposites coexist? The attribute of justice is highly conditional, and the attribute of mercy is highly unconditional. So therefore, how can they both coexist in the same framework? And the answer to that is a very deep secret. Because what it tells us is that to operate both of these attributes together, the only way that you can do that is that they both have to be hidden from each other. In other words, which of the two attributes are the stronger one? If you put them both in a boxing ring and they're represented by angels, the angel of justice and the angel of mercy, which one is the stronger angel? Which one has the greatest strength? Justice is ruled by truth. The truth, emes, rules justice. And mercy is ruled by love. Because you're trying to save someone who doesn't deserve to be saved. Why? Because you love him. Which is stronger, truth or love? Well, that's a nice philosophical question. But the answer to that question is truth is greater than love. We say, Hashem Elokechem emes, God is the God of truth. And even though we know that God loves us, but there is no necessarily direct statement where we say, Hashem Elokei Ahava. But there is a direct statement, Hashem Elokechem emes. So therefore we see in a confrontation between the two attributes, one being conditional, the attribute of justice, and the other being unconditional, the attribute of mercy. The attribute of mercy, of justice, always wins out. So that creates an inherent contradiction on the coexistence of these two attributes to each other. So how can they survive together? And the answer is they are hidden from each other. God, in order to do compassion, has to hide it. He has to hide its manifestation. He has to hide the manifestation from the attribute of justice. In other words, if the attribute of justice is able to see the operation of the attribute of mercy, he suddenly screams at the top of his lungs and he says, "What is this? This is a complete deviation. It's a complete abnormality. How can you have something called compassion or mercy when existence is totally conditional on your relationship with God? If you have a relationship, then you're worthy of Olam Haba. And if you don't have a relationship, you're not worthy of Olam Haba." So therefore we see that the two attributes are contradictory. So the only way that mercy can exist is how? How could mercy exist? Only by hiding it. That's right. It has to be hidden. The Torah can't really speak about the mechanism which underlies the attribute of compassion. The Torah can speak about the attribute of justice. It can talk about that, but it really cannot talk about the attribute of mercy, because when you talk about it, suddenly that information goes to the attribute of justice. And the attribute of justice suddenly becomes aware that there's another attribute that's also operating at the same time called mercy. And he would object to that with full force, with all his strength, that in the light of truth, mercy cannot exist. Because mercy has nothing to do with truth. Mercy has to do with love. And since the world was created conditionally by a certain truth that a person has to masaken or correct the problem of malachab, that remains the central condition which allows a person to continue to exist in Olam Haba. And if he doesn't fix the problem of malachab, or bread of shame, he can't exist in Olam Haba. And that's the fundamental truth which governs. So therefore, when God is merciful, he's merciful in a hidden way, never in the eyes of justice. Because if justice sees God being merciful, it will object. And God, who created the attribute of justice, would have to listen to it, and so on. Because that's a fundamental condition in which the world was created. So the main question is, how does God hide it? In other words, how does he hide it? How do you hide compassion from judgment? Well, there's one answer which is a very strange answer. The attribute of judgment is really overrun by a certain angel. The name of that angel is called the malachab, the angel of judgment. And his name is called the Satan, which actually means a district attorney. A Satan is an accusing angel. So the malach who controls the attribute of justice is called a district attorney angel in the court of heaven. Now, when it comes to the attribute of mercy, it will also have to be controlled by a certain angel who completely controls the dynamic of the attribute of mercy. But if the angel who's in charge of justice sees the angel who's in charge of mercy, he would dismiss him completely, since he's much more powerful. So therefore, the attribute of mercy cannot exist in any form of an angel, because that would become obvious to the attribute of justice. So what does God do? So what God does is a very strange event. We say, who is the angel of justice? And his name is the Satan. But if I ask you a question, who is the angel of mercy, who has to remain hidden? Who would you say? Well, you wouldn't say, because you wouldn't know. In other words, there's no angel which is actually in charge of mercy. And the reason for that is because if he was known and identified, he would always be objected to by the attribute or the angel of judgment. So therefore, what God has done something very bizarre. Who is the angel of mercy? That's the question. And the answer to the question is, the angel of mercy is nothing more than the angel of justice. In other words, God, when he wants to be merciful, turns the angel of justice, turns it around. He turns it into the angel of mercy. It's one and the same, but one does not know each other. So when a person does a sin, he is governed by the attribute of justice. But when suddenly someone deserves mercy, what happens? The attribute of justice, which is designed to accuse him of a sin, suddenly converts. He suddenly transforms into the attribute of what? Of mercy. This is a very strange event. Why? Because they're not hidden. They're hidden from each other. If the same angel who rules justice is the same as the one who rules mercy, and both are kept from each other, because as one consciousness persists, the other consciousness is hidden. Consciousness can only abide one time. To be conscious is to be aware, And if you are conscious of the fact that you're the angel of justice, you're not conscious that you're also the angel of mercy. God places a curtain in between the two levels of consciousness. That's right. Both consciousness that cannot coexist at the same time. You are either one consciousness or another consciousness. You are either consciousness of justice or the consciousness of mercy. Both of them cannot coexist. So in that way, God hides the consciousness of mercy from the consciousness of justice, since it's the same angel who does both. But when he does both, he doesn't know it. He only knows what he is at one stage of consciousness. When he's performing acts of justice, like accusations and so on, he's called the angel of justice. And when he performs acts of mercy, he's called the angel of mercy. But he is never, ever the same angel at the same time. He is one consciousness followed by another consciousness. And the two levels of consciousness are hidden from each other. Since his consciousness is an act of awareness, and he has two different consciousness, he therefore has two different awarenesses. And his awareness of himself as what? As the angel of justice overrides his awareness of himself as the angel of mercy. So he never truly knows that. And this is the deepest secret in the Torah. If you ask me, what is the deepest secret in the Torah? The deepest secret in the Torah is how God hides mercy from the view of justice. This is a hest upon him. This is the meaning of the pasuk. Hasta asta espanai. I will hide my face, meaning that when I do mercy, justice cannot observe it because it's now occupied by an angel in a different form. So he cannot see when that very same angel is now acting in the form of justice. Well, okay, good. So now we see how you hide it. But the question is, how are you able to save the person through an act of mercy? Because we have to understand, justice and mercy leaves you with two different alternatives. Justice demands what? If a person does a sin, what does justice demand? So most people think that justice demands death or some kind of pain. But the truth is, justice does not demand pain at all. Justice knows nothing about pain. It only knows about consequence, not about process. So justice said, if the man sinned, he unplugged from God, and therefore he should be annihilated. The concept that a person should survive the annihilation and he should be in pain is senseless. It doesn't make sense to justice because he's unplugged. And if you unplug a lamp from the socket, the light goes out completely. There is no light left. So therefore, when a person does a sin and unplugs from God, technically speaking, his light completely goes out. So the concept of pain, where a person survives even though he sinned, is meaningless to the attribute of justice. That's why God has to hide mercy, because he has to allow the person to survive the sin that he did. Well, okay, let's look at it. How does the person survive the sin that he did? Even though you're going to change the same angel from justice into an angel of mercy, well, really, what's the difference? What does the angel of mercy demand that's so different from the angel of justice? Well, justice demands annihilation, because sinning is unplugging from God, terminating a relationship between you and God. So therefore, what it demands is the concept of what? Of annihilation. What about mercy? Well, mercy demands something else. And why is mercy satisfied with pain? What does pain have to do with anything of a person sinning? Because what happens is that justice, the angel of justice, suddenly goes into a different state of mind. His consciousness is limited. That's right. In a certain sense, it's boundaried or bordered. So therefore, he lacks the full level of consciousness in which an angel normally has. When he's the angel of justice, he's fully conscious, and he's fully conscious of the consequence of a sin. But suddenly when he's converted to the consciousness of mercy, his consciousness is limited, and so on. And what does the limitation on the consciousness of an angel produce? Well, the one thing about an angel is fully conscious of the unity of God. He's fully conscious of the power of God and who God is. But if suddenly you begin to limit his consciousness, his awareness of that power is limited. He does not see God in the same way as he saw him before. So it's a certain Yerida, it's a descent from that consciousness. Whereas as an angel of justice, he's fully cognizant of the power of God, because that's the power of truth. But when he's converted suddenly to the angel of mercy, suddenly his consciousness goes down. it descends and becomes limited. And what's the result? The result is a very strange thing. The result is that that angel can no longer see the power of God. He sees the strength of God by seeing a certain level of Kedusha. But that sight is really limited, substantially limited. So the malachab therefore does not see the absolute unity of God. The power of God rests in his unity, that there's nothing outside. Enoid movadoi or eneid. There is nothing outside of God. God has no outside. He contains everything. But as the angel of mercy doesn't see that, so therefore God appears to him to be limited. In other words, God is really all-powerful, but he thinks of himself as also all-powerful. God, in other words, has a competitor. He has an angel, in this case, the angel of justice, who was converted to the angel of mercy, which can also exist independently of him. So he actually believes that he exists independently of God. By limiting the consciousness of the angel of justice to a quasi-consciousness, to a semi-consciousness, he limits the ability of that angel to be aware of his own existence. And he believes that he is the exception to the rule, Hashem Echad. All angels see the principle of Hashem Echad, that there's one God, that the unity of God is so awesome and so powerful that God does not have an outside. He has nothing. He does not share existence with anyone. He is a complete and total manifestation. But once you limit the mind of an angel, so suddenly he sees that this is not true. There can be another manifestation besides God. And who is that? Well, it's himself. He sees himself as someone who can exist besides God. Of course, he has to get the strength to do it. He has to obtain a certain energy and a certain strength to be able to live outside of God. But it is possible. It is possible in his consciousness, because his consciousness is limited and accepts the idea of a partial unity. So now that he sees that God is only a partial unity, and that he can accept the independence to God of himself, the angel of mercy, how does he obtain the energy to compete with God? Well, he takes that energy from the person that sins. When a person sins, he contaminates his soul. That means that his soul now is under the condition, his soul is under the condition of a descent in Kedusha. Kedusha is a certain energy that comes from God. And the soul which sins is reduced in its Kedusha in the way it relates to God. This Kedusha is the energy of the soul. Now that the person has sinned, he therefore relinquishes that energy. And guess who takes up the energy instead of the person? The angel of mercy. He is able to absorb the energy which was used up in doing the sin. So a very powerful thing happens. Not only is his consciousness limited by the angel of mercy, but he is able to absorb the Kedusha that was abandoned and given up by the person who sinned. That's right. He absorbs the Kedusha and he becomes much greater. So now we have a completely different situation. Whereas before he was the angel of justice, demanding annihilation, now he's the angel of mercy, and he does not want to annihilate the person. Of course not. Why? Because that person is his food supply. That person can provide him with the energy that he requires to what? To conform to his limited consciousness. Now the angel can compete with God and exist separately from God. So now we have a completely different state of affairs. We have an angel now, the only one of its kind, because no other angel even thinks like this. Every angel who was ever created knows the absolute unity and sovereignty of God, except the alternative angel, who is now the angel of mercy, that previously had the consciousness of the angel of justice. He now sees God as a limited being, that God is very powerful, but yet he is not so powerful that he doesn't have an outside. God does have an outside. And who is that outside? Well, him, the angel of mercy. He can be an outside to God because he can be independent of God. So therefore, he believes that if he acquires enough energy, in this case, Kedusha, from the person who sins, which is now entitled to him. Why? Because he has all access to all Kedusha, which is given up, which is abandoned. And therefore, he seeks to have an entitlement of this energy. So therefore, this angel, the angel of mercy, now sees the person as a source of his food, as a source of his energy. And now that he can absorb this energy, he expands and becomes greater and greater. And eventually he actually thinks that he can outshine God. That's right. That's what the distortion is done to the angel of mercy. He is completely distorted as a malach. He is not a normal malach. He believes that he can be outside God. And as he believes that in his core, he manifests himself outside of God, and he can exist beyond God's total existence. But in order to exist beyond God's total existence, he has to derive energy. He has to absorb the energy of the Jew who sinned. And where does that energy come from? It comes from the soul of the Jew who sinned. By sinning, the Jew gives up that energy that he possesses and gives it up. And the recipient of that energy is now the angel of mercy. So what the angel of mercy wants now is to take that energy. He sees the person as his food supply, as the provider of the energy, which will allow him to compete with God and eventually become an outside. So in other words, God has changed the angel of justice, which demands annihilation, to the angel of mercy, which denies, which supports survival. He supports the survival of the Zulasa, the recipient, in order to take from him his energy. So this is the mechanism, the hidden mechanism of mercy to justice. Justice demands annihilation. Mercy demands survival. Mercy is given to the angel of mercy, and through his actions, he believes that he can absorb this energy which the person abandoned through his sins and eventually compete with God. So the question is, what is the name of this angel of mercy? What is the name of the angel of mercy? And the answer is the malachab, the angel of death. Because the angel of death feels that by separating the body and the soul, he can reabsorb the energy of the soul. And therefore, he becomes greater. And the person, of course, becomes weaker. But the person now is the food supply, the energy supply to the angel of what? Of mercy. This is the mechanism of mercy. This is how it's done. And this is how it's hidden. It's hidden. The angel of justice is hidden from the angel of mercy, even though they're the same angel. Because as soon as the man sins, the angel of justice is suddenly diminished and becomes the angel of mercy who thinks that he is outside God. And that's the malachab. The angel of death is given the dominion over mankind, and that's why he earns death. He's able to rip the soul out of the body and so on, and take the energy which that soul possesses. Every time a person dies, he gives up a soul, but part of the soul that he gives up goes to the Satan. The energy of that soul goes to the Satan. He's now the Satan, the malachab mercy. The fundamental purpose of this whole thing is to hide mercy from justice, because the two cannot coexist together. So therefore they coexist subsequently, one after another. Now the final question, the real question is, okay, now that the angel of mercy becomes stronger and begins to compete with God because he has a newfound kedusha, how does that angel disappear? Because as long as that angel has dominion, he doesn't disappear. And the person can't get rid of his sin. So the way he disappears is a very strange way. Because since the angel of mercy now acquires a new energy, kedusha, of the person who sins, he becomes greater. And therefore, when he becomes greater, he actually begins to materialize as someone outside of God. You have to understand, only he has that power. Only he has the power to exist besides God. And as he absorbs more and more energy of all the people who sinned, he gradually is able to rebel against God. That's right. He defies God and he rebels against God with this newfound energy. But what happens to him? What happens to him in the end? Well, exactly the opposite of what he thinks. Why? Because when it says about God, Ein Od, there is no other, this is not a supposition. This is not a hypothesis. This is a reality. Nothing can exist outside of God. Absolutely nothing. This is the power of God. This is the unity of God. God is known by his unity, that there is nothing outside of him. He contains all. So suddenly when this angel of mercy acquires a new energy, which makes him stronger, and he gradually begins to acquire the possibility to go outside of God, instantly, what happens to him? The angel of death, which killed the person specifically, now acquires his energy. And that energy makes him more real. But the reality that he becomes annihilates him. Why? Because there's a certain thing called the yichud pressure of God. God's absolute unity precludes the possibility of anything being outside of him. And if anything even approaches that possibility, he is immediately annihilated by the yichud of the Bnei Shalom, by the absolute unity of the Bnei Shalom. So in other words, even though he's successful, and he takes the kedusha of the one who sins, right? And he becomes more powerful. But what happens? As he becomes more powerful, he's immediately annihilated. Why? because he suddenly enters into the realm of the impossible. You cannot exist outside of God. That is the most fundamental truth of all existence. You cannot exist outside of God. So since this angel has acquired new energy and thinks that with this new energy he can exist outside of God, he's sadly mistaken. Slowly he dissolves, he disappears. And this is what happens to him. And as he disappears, the sin of the person disappears also. So the person is saved. He is saved from annihilation by disappearing the angel which has absorbed his Kedusha. He has given over his Kedusha to his sins, and it goes to a malach. And therefore the malach suddenly takes dominion over the person and initiates death. That's why this malach is the malach HaMavis. And as he initiates death, he reabsorbs the energy of the person. But suddenly, he realizes his miscalculation. But as he becomes stronger and begins to appear outside of God, he's instantly annihilated because nothing can exist outside of God. So therefore, fundamentally, this angel has two opposing impulses. He has the impulse to absorb energy. That's his impulse, because now he wants to become outside of God. But at the same time, as he absorbs that energy, he commits suicide. Because to absorb the energy which allows you to be outside of God, therefore annihilates you. Nobody can exist outside of God. So this is how the person is saved. This is how God actually saves people. He converts the angel of justice into an angel of mercy. But that angel of mercy is limited in his ability to see God and to understand the unity and the power of God. And he thinks that he can be outside of God. He can attain independence. And the answer is, how? He obtains independence by absorbing the Kedusha of the person who sinned. So he thinks he's a success, but his success is doomed. Because as he succeeds to go outside of God, he's instantly annihilated. So his success is his doom. His success is suicide. So this is fundamentally the mechanism of how God saves mankind. God saves mankind by letting this energy define mankind and be given over to the angel of justice that accused him. And as the angel of justice becomes an angel of mercy, his consciousness is limited. And as he begins to absorb the energy from the person, how? By a certain death, by a separation of soul from body, this angel suddenly disappears. What a terrible miscalculation. So mercy is done through a complete miscalculation. Mercy is granted. How? By an angel who actually thinks that he can exist outside of God. By an angel who actually absorbs the energy of the soul through a sin. And finally, this dooms him because of the fundamental yichud pressure of God. There cannot be an outside. There cannot be another manifestation of God. Now we come back to the original question. Why does God want to hide the light of the first day? Because that light reveals the whole mechanism. It reveals that in order to obtain mercy, God has to convert the consciousness of the angel of justice to the angel of mercy and put him in a position where he sees the person as his food supply. But that, in the end, will doom the angel itself, because nothing can exist outside of God. And this entire scenario is contained in that light. That light covers and reveals the scenario which takes place between the alternative occurrence between justice and mercy. If God would have what? If God would have revealed this first light, suddenly the angel of justice would have known that he becomes the angel of mercy. He would have realized it, that that's how God is hiding mercy from him, by making him himself the angel of mercy. The angel of justice becomes the angel of mercy. And finally, he dooms himself by his success. And if this light was revealed to the world, and suddenly mankind would know it, and the angels would know it, you could not do this. Because this could only be done when the angel of justice has no knowledge that suddenly, as the person sins, he becomes himself the angel of mercy, and eventually his success dooms him. And this mechanism could not have been carried out because the angel of justice would have understood that light. The light is not hidden from mankind as such. The light is hidden from the malachab themselves. This light was completely hidden from every conscious being who was ever created. Why? Because if that light is not hidden, then the transformation of justice to mercy into the same angel would have become totally known by everyone, by all malachim. And once it's totally known, you cannot convert the angel of justice to the angel of mercy. He would have objected to the mechanism itself. He would have said to God, it's impossible what you're doing. You're making me now the angel of justice into the angel of mercy. How could you do this? I oppose this. I oppose this by the standard of truth. Emes. So we see the power of the hidden. God has to hide this phenomena, this event, so that mercy can exist and gradually disappear on its own. But only because mercy itself is the transformation of the angel of justice. Only when that angel does not know what's happening to him when a person sins, only then could that mechanism transpire. Otherwise, mercy is impossible, because mercy is the logical alternative of what? Of justice. So therefore we see the depth of this. This is one of the deepest secrets of the Torah itself. This comes from a light which is completely hidden from every conscious being in existence. It's a light which allows the contradiction of mercy and the contradiction of justice to coexist temporarily, so that it allows the human being, the Zulasoi, to survive his sin. So that's why we see why this light was hidden, to allow the world to continue. The world can only continue if God grants mercy, and mercy can only be granted if it's hidden completely from justice. And that can only be done if the same angel who does justice who demands justice and annihilation becomes an angel of mercy who demands now that man survives, so that man will give him the energy that he possesses to this new angel, and this new angel can survive outside of God. So this whole thing is a series of contradictions. But that's how God, I believe, characterizes the attribute of mercy. Mercy is the opposite alternative to justice. So the angel of mercy is the very self-same angel of justice itself. So now we see why God wants to hide this, so that he will allow the world to continue. And he hides this throughout history completely, so that it always remains hidden until the end. What end? Until Tchias HaMesim, the resurrection of the dead. Because when this death stops, no longer will this angel of justice be converted to an angel of mercy. The process that stops, God said the process will continue until the resurrection of the dead. And now you understand why the resurrection of the dead is so important, because it allows man to survive his sins. But to survive his sins, he has to actually change the angel which wants to terminate his existence. Therefore, the whole thing is hidden. The whole thing is beneath cognitive awareness. And until the time of Tchias HaMesim, when suddenly this whole thing will be revealed, is only when what? When it's no longer necessary, when mankind will lose his free will, he will not be able to sin. And once free will is gone, then the possibility of sinning is gone. And when the possibility of sinning is gone, the possibility of free will is gone. Where there is no free will, there's no possibility of annihilation. That's the connection of all of these things. So therefore, I think I've explained to some extent how this thing happens and why God must hide the Orishan. And this Orishan is the 50th gate. It is the final light which reveals what God is doing, how God can allow two logical impossibilities to coexist at the same time, justice and mercy. So therefore, he creates a mechanism which allows that possibility. Let us hope that as we approach the Messianic time, we approach the possibility of what? Where the entire mechanism of death will be forfeit. No longer will men die. No longer will men sin. But every man will go to his position in Olam Haba based on his credibility and that which he has earned. Let's hope for the day and bless the day that occurs. The resurrection of the dead is the final redemption of mankind, because it means that death is no longer possible. The acquisition by the angel of death of the energy of a person will no longer be true. Each person has assigned to him a specific angel of death under the charge of the total agent of death, who's in charge of the whole event itself. And one day there will be no death, and therefore there will be no aging. People will not age anymore, and there will be no pain. Pain is not necessary when there is no sin, and mercy is not required. So with the elimination of death, the elimination of aging, the elimination of what? Of pain. These will be the greatest gifts given to mankind. And mankind will then be in a new state, in a state of Adam Rishon, the first man, before he sinned, which was the original state that he was in. And once he returns from that state to the original state, which precluded death, he will then be possible for him to create a state called Olam Haba, which is the next step. The next step, once you eliminate death, is to eliminate time and space, is to eliminate the fundamental parameters of Olam Hazeh. And we hope this comes soon in our day. Thank you. Okay, that's the share.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think I've given a very clear explanation of what it is that God is hiding. The whole mechanism itself, as clear as possible. Okay. Thank you very much for listening.
Rabbi Shimon, can I ask you a question?
What's the question?
Does the Mashiach ben Don have a role in revealing the Nun?
Yes. In the end, the Mashiach ben Don will reveal the whole Nun, the entire mechanism of death, the mechanism of life, the mechanism which allows us to have free will be revealed. And I believe he will be the one that finally will reveal the total information.
Interesting. And
yes. Okay.
I'm curious, how did Gehenna fit into the framework, by the way?
Well, Gehenna is another way in which the angel acquires energy. As you atone in Gehenna, Gehenna is like a hospital. And you have to go to a hospital and you cannot go to a feast. So Gehenna is like a hospital. But the angel of death acquires your energy while you're in Gehenna. All of this allows him to fundamentally obtain the energy he needs, you see it, to confront God. But in the end, all of it disappears.
The process of death, it seems like it should be enough to give him that energy.
Well, I don't think you're in a position to evaluate the amount of energy that he requires. So I don't think you really can be a judge of this. Do you?
No, probably not.
So then why make that remark?
Because you see, it said death is when the soul is ripped out of the body and the energy of the soul goes to the angel. So there's
it does, but there's only a certain amount of it goes. But the actual intricacies of the mechanism is really unknown to us because it's very subtle.
When a person sins, they're taking in energy somehow. Is that what's going on? And that has to be returned?
Well, they're giving out energy. They're giving away their Kedusha. They're not taking it in. They're giving it out. Whether Satan, the angel of judgment, or the angel of mercy in either case, now has control over it. But this is a whole other matter. Okay, thank you for listening.